The culture of critical thinking is really a culture of self-confidence. In other words, being open to discussion is one thing that is a hallmark. In other words, I can discuss the things I believe in. I speak because I know the answer to the question of why. Why do I believe this, or why do I act this way? Why do I have this thought? If I know this, it means I have self-confidence. Therefore, I can easily defend my sensitivities because I believe they are true. But if you do not have reasons, that is, if you think by rote, believe by rote, and act by rote, of course your sensitivities become very sensitive, like an open wound. Even if the wind blows, it starts to hurt. Even if a fly lands on it, you complain. Critical thinking gives us the power to defend the truth of our beliefs to the end.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, our guest this week is Dr. Yasin Ramazan. Welcome, Professor. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Thank you very much, teacher. We want to talk about critical thinking. Why do we need it? Why do we need to do critical thinking?
Because we live together, so we don't just think with our own minds, we think as a community. We use each other's minds. So we have a lot of contact with each other as we live our daily lives or in our professional lives. It's not just us, we have to live together. That's why we need to think critically. Of course, we've also drawn some boundaries for critical thinking. So when it comes to your very personal preferences, for example, you don't have to think critically about what color jacket you're going to wear at work. That's a matter of taste. It's something you can arbitrarily decide on. Or you can eat whatever you want for lunch, or not eat whatever you want, as long as your means allow. But it's not all like that. We have to make decisions that affect each other's lives, futures, and even pasts. We have to think about each other. When this comes into play, critical thinking comes into play. So let's say a judge shouldn't make arbitrary decisions. When he makes a decision in a case, he should make a decision that respects justice, because the decision he makes will affect everyone's life. Similarly, when a doctor applies a treatment method, he must make decisions that are grounded in reason and evidence, rather than arbitrary choices. This reflective process is essential so that another doctor can later confirm or challenge his decisions, ensuring they are based on sound medical principles and best practices, ultimately prioritizing the patient's well-being and safety.
In fact, there is a judgment here. We are talking about some criteria that should be taken into consideration. But when we take the concept alone, this critical thinking is understood more negatively. It is as if it is understood more in relation to the negative side of the concept of criticism. We are actually talking about something different.
Of course, this word critical also has a negative meaning in English. In daily use, you don't like it if someone criticizes you or criticizes you, because there is something that says that the situation you are in shouldn't be the same. In other words, it has a slightly disturbing side. In daily life, of course, criticism is thought of as something completely negative. But in fact, criticism is extremely positive because it makes dialogue possible, because it makes shopping possible, because it makes the exchange of views and information between us possible. It is indispensable for living together and developing and growing together, inevitably there. If I continue with the example I just gave, when a doctor thinks critically while making a decision, it is possible for another doctor to see whether those decisions are right or wrong, and thus a more correct treatment can be applied. Otherwise, everything would be very arbitrary. Or when a manager is managing a place, he does not make decisions very arbitrarily. He makes everyone's control open. He somehow presents a method of thinking, and we can criticize whether those reasons are right or wrong. It may make us feel a little bad because it disrupts our arbitrariness. In other words, it may create ego pressure, but it is actually a matter of habit. As we criticize, we need to learn how to criticize without personalizing it. When we are criticized, we need to understand it without personalizing it and be able to figure out what to respond to or what to fix and how.
It's like a struggle with the ego, sir.
It definitely is. I mean, it feels like an attack on your ego. For example, you write a book. There are those who like the book and those who don't. Criticism is a very important point. Criticism can be ideas. It can be behaviors. A person cannot be criticized, because the person is outside the layer of criticism. What do we criticize? We criticize whether an idea is right or not, or whether a behavior is appropriate. People are not criticized. What is done? They can be manipulated. People can be given advice, preached to. People can be insulted. But there is no criticism, because criticism is a corrective activity, and words can be corrected, beliefs can be corrected, behaviors can be corrected. But correcting people is the wrong usage. That's why people are not criticized. People are not criticized. Thoughts are criticized. When we understand this, when a criticism, for example, a criticism of a book we wrote comes, stop being disturbed. After a while you start to enjoy it, because you understand that what you wrote has a response. You have been understood, and because you have been understood, a response has been given to it. But it is necessary to adjust its dose and level correctly. In other words, not to the person's ego, but to see the mistakes of the work done and to correct them. If it is to be done better, it is necessary to give an idea of how it will be done. In this sense, critical thinking is actually an evaluation activity. An activity of evaluation within quotes. Because we are trying to determine how much value it has. So, if we briefly go back to why critical thinking is done, not everything we have has the same value. In other words, they have different values and we try to understand those values. This is the basic function of critical thinking. If another person can determine the value of a decision made by a judge in a case, yes, this is a correct decision, or if they can say that there is a mistake in this decision, we can determine its value compared to other decisions. Otherwise, the good decision and the bad decision would have the same value.
I saw it as a very high-level activity, sir. It seems like it is not possible to make it an activity that is very academic or something that judges can do, as you said, that we can all integrate into our daily lives.
It's not that wrong.
Yes. Are you criticizing me or my opinion, sir?
I am criticizing your idea. Look, I am not saying that you are very wrong or that you said it very badly, but it is a wrong idea. Why is that? Because critical thinking is actually a matter of culture. So it is a matter of habit, and our mental habits should show us this. We should be able to analyze something immediately and distinguish their good and bad sides. In other words, it is not something that comes automatically, it is something that is acquired. We can acquire it, we can spread it. It is not for nothing that we call it culture. It is a matter of habitat, that is, something that will develop together with its environment, and most of the things that make up that environment are actually virtues such as goodwill, tolerance, listening. For example, my listening to you, your listening to me is something that will give birth to critical thinking as a virtue. Now, for example, the things we say in this program, my claims are always open to criticism. Because I am also a human being, I can make mistakes. If there is a mistake, pointing it out means that I am being listened to. And this is an opportunity for me. In other words, let me say something, write something or present a product, but throw it into the void. How can I understand how valuable it is if there is no feedback? Or I cannot understand how right it is, how good it is, how beautiful it is. Of course, we do not care about this in some things, so we don't have to think so much about what we do in our free time. But when we think in our daily lives, critical thinking actually provides us with a very serious flexibility. For example, not taking criticism of a work we do personally is not something that is specific to judges, doctors, or academics. So you might have arranged flowers in your home or room. You might have cooked a meal. So how can I do this better if you don't like it? What don't I like? You can say I can try. Or it can be an unfair criticism. You can say to that, if I do it this way, it won't work that way. For example, if I give this flower this much water, it won't work that way. Or if I take it from here and put it there, it will grow. It shouldn't get too much light, or it should get more light. We can also respond. Not every criticism has to be justified this time, but we don't have to feel hostility towards the person who says it. In other words, perhaps one of our strongest aspects as a species is that we can produce fruit without conflict. If we can continue our conflicts in a very civilized manner, if we learn from each other's mistakes, we can do more correct, more beautiful, better things.
I would like to talk about social media as the place where criticism is most clearly seen right now. In fact, there is a lynching culture here rather than critical thinking. Because we misunderstand criticism. Instead of criticizing ideas, people prefer to attack people.
There we witness a very serious ego war. In other words, one of the basic starting points of lynching culture is to feel together. In other words, this is actually based on a very basic instinct. In other words, it is based on something like, we are part of a whole, let's lynch this one, let's see how many people we are. In other words, it is impossible to satisfy these. Especially on social media, it is not possible at all. Because no matter how much you feed it, it increases that thirst even more. In other words, it is like drinking salt water when you are thirsty. If you pay attention on social media, you will see that something you write. In other words, even the most beautiful thing can be degraded or attributed to something. You say the weather is beautiful today. The other says, how can you talk about the beauty of the weather when children are dying in the world? Now, these are irrelevant things. Therefore, this is not a culture of criticism. This is a culture of satisfying the ego, but we need to understand that we will not be satisfied this way. Criticism is something that is done consciously in order to reach a more accurate thought. We cannot think critically without being aware of it. It has such a difficult side. It requires more effort, but the satisfaction is greater.
Unfortunately, this may be due to a lack of knowledge of logic, disconnected from context. In other words, instead of criticizing and discussing within a certain logical framework, they can present something taken from a different context as a subject of criticism. This time, they actually become part of a lynching culture.
The biggest enemy of this culture spreading is actually a set of mental habits. In other words, there are fallacies or cognitive tendencies. These are things that satisfy some of our animal instincts in a sense. For example, let's think of the fallacy of denigrating someone. In other words, you don't evaluate the other person's words, but you start to evaluate that word based on who they are. In other words, you start by saying that if you say it, it's wrong. However, we need to be able to evaluate it independently of the person who said it and see its value. Otherwise, ego pressure will never allow us to distinguish right from wrong. We will always be the ones who say it. We will never be wrong. We see around us how big mistakes people make by approaching it this way, and we do it ourselves. There are other fallacies, there are cognitive tendencies, we have psychological needs. When we consider these, critical thinking is actually a healthy way of thinking. In other words, how can we go beyond our habits, our need for a certain level of approval, and have a measure that can distinguish right from wrong?
In fact, maybe it's also related to prejudices, the inability to criticize an idea that is independent of that person's personality. The prejudice against that person may be against their previous ideas or may not be against anything.
It can be generalization. For example, there are erroneous generalizations, which is one of the things that prevents thinking. In other words, too many generalizations. All women are like this, all men are like this, Turks are like this, Kurds are like that. In other words, they are really uncontrollably broad. Maybe we can use these things very easily in our daily conversations. But if we talk about the truth of the matter, if we approach it critically, for example, there are 4 billion women and 4 billion men in the world. We need to be able to predict that all generalizations will be erroneous.
Are all generalizations wrong, sir?
No, except for one. All generalizations are wrong except this one.
So how can we understand whether we have this critical thinking culture? How should we differentiate this?
The culture of critical thinking is really a culture of self-confidence. In other words, being open to discussion is one thing. In other words, this is a hallmark. In other words, I can discuss and speak about the things I believe in because I know the answer to the question of why. In other words, why do I believe this or act this way? Why do I have this thought? If I know this, it means I have self-confidence. Therefore, I can easily defend my sensitivities because I believe they are true. But if you do not have reasons, in other words, if you think by rote, believe by rote, and act by rote, of course your sensitivities become very sensitive like an open wound. Even if the wind blows, it starts to hurt. Even if a fly lands on it, you complain. Critical thinking gives us the power to defend the truth of our beliefs to the end. At the end of our discussions, it turns out that we were wrong. We have nothing to lose. Because if the opinion is correct, we accept the truth anyway. It is that simple. Therefore, critical thinking teaches us to be self-confident, and as we become self-confident, we can think even more critically. We can control variables both in terms of our own beliefs and in terms of the beliefs of others. When I say control, I mean we can control them in the sense of controlling them, not in the sense of managing them. We can see what is variable and what is fixed. And this brings us to another feature of critical thinking culture. Critical thinking culture is a culture of knowing the limits. In other words, it is a culture of thinking, knowing and being aware that nothing is unlimited, that we also have our own limits. The more our limits are known, that is, the limits of our knowledge, for example, are known, the more we have the opportunity to reach what we do not know. For example, I am a philosopher. If you ask me a question about economics, about the economy, the answers I will give to this may be very misleading because, my knowledge of economics is sufficient for me. I cannot convey this to you. In other words, it is a choice like my choice of jacket. But if you ask an economist, can answer that question in a way that you can follow. So knowing our limits, knowing the limits of our knowledge, knowing the limits of our experience, for example. So, let's say you've never been to Mongolia. You haven't read anything about Mongolia. We learn in the culture of critical thinking that you shouldn't generalize about Mongolia because we don't know. We have limits. We can't know everything. We have limits regarding history. We have limits regarding geography. We have cognitive limits. We have limits regarding language. So how do we think amidst all this limitation? The real question is here, and I think that limitation creates creativity in every sense. For example, if a word has no limit to its meaning, that word doesn't mean anything. So the word truth is a bit like that. For example, if its limits are not clear, you can call everything truth. Even if truth is limitless, its definition must have limits. I say this in this sense. And if we don't know these limits, we can use everything in every sense. This doesn't allow us to distinguish right from wrong. And the culture of critical thinking shows us this. Thanks to being self-confident and being aware of our limits, we learn to be respectful to each other. In other words, I have something to learn from you too. Or there are some right or wrong places in your criticism of me. You are also an individual, I am also an individual. We create a culture of respect. It increases respect for each other. This brings society and people to a point where they support each other based on common values. In other words, it is generally said that critical thinking actually has the opposite effect. If there is criticism, there is no unity. On the contrary, if there is no criticism, everything is swept under the rug. There is no idea of unity there because trust does not arise, respect does not arise. In other words, if I think there are things hidden in your mind, in your head, inside you, unspoken, secret agendas, I cannot trust you, you cannot trust me. But if we talk, share, discuss, we develop respect for each other, and a relationship of trust emerges in that respect. As a result, we establish a solid social structure and a solid future.
What is the status of critical thinking studies in Turkey and the world, Professor, I ask, because you follow both foreign literature. What is the status of critical thinking studies in Turkey on both sides? What is its place in the world? How are other studies at the moment?
Critical thinking is becoming a very important field, especially in the academy after 2000, because philosophy, especially in the field of philosophy, as in all other fields, academics and employees deal with very specific things. We all do this. We work in a different, very narrow framework. This is one of the things we do. But what is the outcome of this? In other words, how can we benefit other fields or humanity in general? How can we offer a positive outcome? This actually happens through critical thinking. For example, it has become a compulsory course in all departments in many universities around the world. Because no matter what field it is in, whether it is verbal, numerical, humanities, social sciences, having critical thinking skills means having a critical thinking ability related to that field. It means developing the ability to distinguish the right from the wrong of information or data. Similarly, we see that it is a rising field in Turkey. In this sense, we see that there are books written in the last 10 years. Translations are being published. Perhaps what I should point out here is that there are some unsettled points regarding terminology. There are different translations or different naming, but I think these can be resolved over time. Another point is that I care about copyrighted works in terms of critical thinking because critical thinking is important. It is something that a person does using their native language. Of course, you can think critically in a foreign language, but that is another matter. But being able to think critically in your native language makes our daily lives more livable, increases respect, and allows us to live that culture. In translations, even if the translation is good, you can sometimes feel that the examples or the style of address given come from a different culture. Then you can become alienated. Since critical thinking is a matter of talent, it is a matter of increasing competence rather than taking it as information and putting it somewhere. That is why this can be a bit difficult. I think that as dangerous works increase, this area will also develop in Turkish.
I hope so, teacher. In fact, this seems to me to be the exact opposite of the lynching culture you mentioned. Like a utopian world where everyone knows the limits of their knowledge, everyone can step aside and say, this is all I know. These are actually the exact opposite of lynching culture. Exactly. Because when we look on the other side, everyone knows everything. No one has any respect for anyone else. We see such a chaotic environment. I hope these copyrighted works will increase, and as you say, I hope we will move towards a geography where the culture of critical thinking and criticism increases. Thank you very much for your valuable comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dear audience, our guest this week was Dr. Yasin Ramazan. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.